This video is going to go over completing the square, and it's also going to go over the square root method. So on your review sheet, that's questions 13 through 17. Now, when we complete the square, here's the steps. First, this is different because usually we're trying to get our equation in standard form. We don't want our equation in standard form when we complete the square. We want to move the constant to the right side of the equation. So what that means, remember, the constant is the term that does not have a variable. That's the one that you're going to want to move to the opposite side of the equation. Okay, number 2, I add a blank on each side of the equation for where I want to find that number that completes the square. And the reason I write it as a blank is because otherwise I feel like I put it on the left side and then I forget to do the same thing on the right side. So if I put those blanks in first, it triggers my brain into remembering that whatever you add to one side of the equation, you must also add to the other. Okay, step 3, we're going to fill in those blanks, and how we're going to find that number is we're going to take our linear term, which is the x term, we're going to divide that number by 2, and then whatever number we get, we're going to square, and that's the number that's going to go into the blank. Okay, so for example, let's say our linear term was 12x. So we would take 12 and divide by 2. That's 6, and then we would do 6 squared, and that would be 36. And that would be the number that we put in our blanks that completes our square. And then finally, we're going to factor it, and we're going to solve the equation. All right, so the first one, we need to move the constant to the right side of the equation. So then we're left with x squared plus 8x equals, now when we move a negative 1 to the right side, it becomes positive 1. Step 2 says we're going to write our blanks on both sides. Plus 8x plus blank equals 1 plus blank. Now remember, to fill in that blank, we take our linear term, which in this case is 8x. We divide that by 2. So 8 divided by 2 gives me 4. And then we square that number. 4 squared gives me 16. So in each of our blanks, we're going to write a 16. So again, that was 8 divided by 2. Which equals 4, and then 4 squared, which equals 16. That's how we find the number that completes the square. Okay, now we need to factor the left side. So we're looking for a number, 2 numbers that multiply to 16 and add to 8. Well, that would be 4 times 4 is 16, and 4 plus 4 is 8. So we can actually factor this x plus 4, which we know we can write x plus 4 squared. That's going to be equal to 1 plus 16, which is 17. All right, now we need to solve this for x. So the first thing we need to figure out is how do we get rid of that squared on the outside of the parentheses? Well, the opposite of squaring something is to do the square root. So we're going to take the square root on both sides. So the squared and the square root, they cancel each other out. So I'm left with x plus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 17. Okay, I still need to get x alone, which means I need to move that positive 4 to the other side. And when I move positive 4 to the right side of the equation, it becomes negative 4, plus or minus the square root of 17. And we have solved the equation by completing this square. All right, number 14, same thing. We need to move the constant to the right side of the equation. So we have x squared minus 10x equals positive 18. Okay, and then remember we're going to put our blanks in. X squared minus 10x plus blank equals 18 plus blank. Okay, now we need to fill in that term that completes the square. So we take our 10. 10 divided by 2 is 5. We take the 5 and we square it. 5 squared is 25. 25 is the number that completes the square. Okay, now we need to factor the left side of the equation. So we're looking for the factors of 25 that add to negative 10. Well, that would be a negative 5 times a negative 5. That would add to a negative 10. So we can factor this as x minus 5 quantity squared equal to 18 plus 25, which is 43. So remember, the next step was to get rid of that squared. The opposite of squaring something is to square root it. So the squared and the square root, they cancel each other out. So we're left with x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 43. Remember, we need to move the 5 to the other side of the equation because we want to get x alone. So it's a negative 5, and when we move it to the right side, it becomes positive 5 plus or minus the square root of 43. All right, next we're doing the extraction of roots theorem, which is basically how we finished out solving these completing the square questions. So we want to isolate the squared term, which means whatever part is squared, we want to get that alone on one side of the equation. And then we take the square root of both sides, because remember, that's how you cancel out squared. Squared and square root are opposites, just like plus and minus or multiplication and division. They cancel each other out. And then finally, we'll solve for x. Another thing to remember is don't forget, if you take the square root of a negative number, then we have to write it as an imaginary number. That's something we haven't talked about since last unit. Okay, so number 15, the squared term is already isolated on the left side of the equation. So we'll start solving this by taking the square root of both sides. So on the left side, the squared and the square root, they cancel each other out. So we have 3x plus 5 equals, remember I said don't forget plus or minus. Now 27 can be broken down into 9 times 3, and 9 has a square root, 3. So we can write that as 3 square root 3 in simplified form. And now we need to solve for x. So first we need to move the 5 to the right side of the equation, which is going to make it a negative 5. And we need to divide everything by 3. It cancels. And we're left with x equals negative 5 plus or minus 3 square root 3 divided by 3. Now, a lot of people want to cancel out those 3's. You cannot reduce unless everything outside of the radical symbol can be reduced. So in this case, since that 5 is there, we cannot reduce. Okay, the next one. This time we don't have the square term isolated, so we're going to have to do a little extra work to start off. First, let's move the 16 to the right side of the equation. That would make it a negative 16. Okay, still we got to get rid of the 4, so we're going to divide both sides of the equation by 4. So now we have 2x minus 1 squared equals negative 4. So now we've isolated the radical. Now we need to solve this thing. So to get rid of the squared, take the square root of both sides. The squared and the square root on the left side cancel. So we're left with 2x minus 1 equals, now think way back to last unit, the square root of negative 4 would be plus or minus 2i. Now we solve for x. We're going to move the negative 1 to the right side, making it a positive 1. So we have positive 1 plus or minus 2i. And we need to divide everything by 2 to cancel out this 2. X equals 1 plus or minus 2i divided by 2. Last question. First step, isolate the squared term. So we need to move that negative 7 to the right side, which will turn it into a positive 7. 4x squared equals 7. Then we need to divide out that 4. X squared equals 7 over 4. Okay, all we have left to do is to get rid of that squared, which means we need to square root both sides of the equation, which leaves us with plus or minus. 7 does not have a square root, so we'll leave that as radical 7. 4 does have a square root, so we'll write that as a 2.